We have an exciting keynote session for you today. The gentleman that's going to be speaking to you today is one of those unique individuals that possess courage. And the type of courage that I speak about centers around our behavior as human beings. Many people use the phrase to be fearless in the face of adversity. What that means to me is to step up and ask the questions, especially the ones that no one else will ask. It's also to not be afraid of what the answers might be to those questions. You pour through those answers until you find the seeds that ring true to your heart, and then you live it. Mr. Gonzalez has demonstrated this throughout his entire life. He was born in Puerto Rico, Ponce, Puerto Rico. Am I saying it correctly, Mr. Gonzalez? Oh, see, I'm so blah. He grew up in Harlem and Brooklyn, New York. He graduated from Brooklyn, New York, okay? He graduated from Columbia College in the mid-'60s. He was very active in the anti-Vietnam War movement. He also participated in a protest that shut down the college in spring of 1968. I mean, already there's a fire there. You know, as a young man, he's there, he's got the fire, he sees what needs to be done, he has the first step of courage. In 1998, he won one of the first George Polk Award for his investigative reporting. He is former president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, for which he created the Parity Project, and that's a program designed to help new organizations recruit and retain Hispanic reporters and managers. He's one of the founding members of the Young Lords Party. In 2008, the National Association, are you from the Young Lords?
No, but I know.
All right, okay, yeah, feel free to applause because this man is amazing. In 2008, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists inducted Mr. Gonzalez into the organization's Hall of Fame. He has had the honor of being named by Hispanic Business Magazine as one of the country's most influential Hispanics, as well as earning a Lifetime Achievement Award for the Hispanic Academy of Media Arts and Science. For 2 years, Mr. Gonzalez was the Bell Zeller Visiting Professor in Public Policy and Administration at where? Here, Brooklyn College, CUNY, yes. With an appointment to both the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies as well as the Political Science Department. In December 2006, he reported the results of an exclusive interview with the purported fourth man who was present at the scene of the November 25th NYPD shooting incident that caused the death of Sean Bell. He has written extensively on Ground Zero illnesses and the cover-up of Ground Zero air hazards in columns in the New York Daily News. He was the first reporter in New York City to write on the health effects arising from the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Mr. Gonzalez was awarded, it's got a long list, but I won't go on. Mr. Gonzalez was awarded the 2010 Justin in Action Award from the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and in 2011, he won yet another George Polk Award for a series of columns in the New York Daily News exposing the scandal behind Mayor Michael Bloomberg's attempt to create new computerized payroll systems called City Time. He has authored 3 books: The Fallout, The Environmental Consequences of the World Trade Center Collapse, Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, Roll Down Your Window, Stories of a Forgotten America. He has been a columnist for the New York Daily News since 1987. He co-hosts the radio and television program Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. Please, let's welcome Mr. Juan Gonzalez.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and congratulations to all of you who are keeping the movement for peace in America alive. We've been running through difficult times of late as our country continues to expand the number of military adventures it engages in around the world. And I apologize for being late. I was up in the Bronx earlier this morning, and it took me a little longer to get back down to central Brooklyn than I thought. So there was a lot more traffic on the Jackie Robinson Park. I'm going to try to come to the back way to be able to avoid the Manhattan traffic, and ended up with some problems. Anyway, I'm honored to be asked to speak at this annual Peace Fair. I understand that I have not been to one in the last few years, but I keep hearing how it's growing and developing each and every year. And I'd like to share with you just some of my experiences as a journalist, and also some of my own sort of research and study into how we've gotten to this situation that the American empire, no matter what happens, just continues to move on. No matter who is president, no matter who we elect, just continues to expand its efforts to control the lives and the destinies of people all around the world, and always at the expense of the American people as well. I'm reading an interesting, well, first let me say, our show on Democracy Now! Yesterday, we had Winona LaDuke on. We had her on because, as you all know, the Navy SEAL action in Pakistan that killed Osama bin Laden, the code name that the U.S. government used for bin Laden was Geronimo. This has raised an enormous outcry among the Native American peoples of the United States, who regard Geronimo as a patriot and a hero of their people. They've been demanding apologies from the federal government for naming Osama bin Laden Geronimo in the code name. And it just so happened that, and of course, when we discussed with Winona LaDuke, we talked about all the other ways that the U.S. military has appropriated Native American names as part of its warfare. We have, of course, the Apache helicopter, the Black Hawk helicopter. We have Tomahawk missiles. As Winona says, much of the slang of the military, when soldiers talk about leaving a base, they talk about going off the reservation. And so there is a long history in the United States military of appropriating Native American names to cloak. I'll never forget when the U.S. was involved in the bombings in Serbia, the press kept on talking about how the Apache helicopters were leading the fight against ethnic cleansing. And nobody caught the irony of Apache helicopters fighting ethnic cleansing. One of the interesting things that I think we often forget about is how much the American battle against Native Americans shaped this militaristic outlook and this enormous expenditures on the military budget that the United States continues to engage in. Most people think that, well, the empire really began after the Spanish-American War and the acquisition of colonial territories. But there's an interesting book that came out last year that I highly recommend by Stephen Rockwell. It's called Indian Affairs and the Administrative State in the 19th Century. And Rockwell's argument is that this conception that many conservative Republicans have today, that the nation needs to return to small government, this idea that back in the 19th century there was this limited government and basically you had pioneer Americans settling across the country without government interference, and that big government is something of the modern 20th century and now to the 21st century. Well, Rockwell attempts to discredit that theory and has a lot of important information about the territorial expansion of the United States. Now, we've all studied this history, but we somehow do not remember it or do not digest the lessons. The United States spread across an entire continent and in the process conquered all kinds of people to establish the modern country that we are today. And we do not really grasp how important the military and the conquest of the Native Americans was to our present identity as a country. Let me just read to you a few sentences from Rockwell's book. And he's quoting other historians who have talked about the enormous amount of government resources that were dedicated to territorial expansion and the conquest of the Native Americans during the 19th century. Remember that the Indian Affairs for much of the 19th century was under the War Department, so that the expenses of subjugating the Native Americans were a subset of the total military budget of the United States. So he says, historian Stephen Aaron tallies war with the Ohio Indians as costing the United States $5 million between 1790 and 1796, accounting for 80% of the federal budget during the Washington administration. Close to 60% of the federal government's expenditures in 1799 and 1800 went to the War and Navy departments, with expenditures for the War Department representing approximately 25% of total federal expenditures. By 1836, War Department expenditures, including the Indian Office, had risen to more than 39% of total federal outlays. Right. He goes on to say that other historians have examined the spikes in federal spending every time there was an Indian war, that including the Creek conflict, Tecumseh's Confederacy, and the War of 1812. Indian Department expenditures are relevant as well, varying widely, but running to as much as 9% of the War Department budget in 1796 and 1818, 19% in 1825, 13% in 1830, and then it goes on 25% in 1832, 27% in 1833. Huge portions of the federal budget in the early years of the country were dedicated to the military and were dedicated to subjugating the Native American peoples. So this issue of a military budget is not new in the United States. In fact, it is part and parcel of the actual development and evolution of the country as a settler state. So we are not the first generation to have dealt with this, although obviously we are a generation that is dealing with it when the United States is the world's reigning empire. And I think the issue of being an empire is something that our citizenry continues to avoid. We continue to avoid the reality that this nation is the most powerful empire in the history of the world. More power to wreck economies halfway around the world in hours than any previous empire ever had. Whether it's the British Empire, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire. This is the most powerful empire in the world. You know, one of the interesting things that people haven't noted about the WikiLeaks, because the other argument that Rockwell raises is that a lot of the expenditures of government to administer this territorial expansion were not just military, but there was a huge bureaucracy that grew to also administer the territorial expansion. You had to, once you took land from the Native Americans, you had to survey it. You had to divide it up, you had to allot it, and interestingly enough, throughout U.S. history, even from the Revolutionary War, the rewards given to the soldiers of the Revolutionary War was land. Was land. Very much like the Spanish conquistadors used to do when they ventured into America. They offered the soldiers who fought to conquer the natives' land. That was the great inducement. And still to this day, the soldiers of the United States military are amazingly rewarded for being in the military. Whether it's through lifetime health coverage, whether it is through discounted loans for homes, whether it is for college education, Those who fight in the military and defend the empire, the government offers enormous inducements to them to be able to continue this expansion of our power. So I think that the issue of the empire, and I've had this, as many of you know, I've been a labor activist as well for many years, and have been involved in a variety of newspaper strikes throughout the years. And one of the big battles that I've constantly waged with the leaders of the American labor movement is that until the labor movement firmly and clearly stands against empire, we will not be able to build a progressive labor movement in the United States. Now, the AFL-CIO has come a long way with it from the times of George Meany and Lane Kirkland, when it was, in essence, an appendage of the empire and helping to destroy progressive labor movements around the country. Now it at least understands that peace is something that labor should be concerned about, organized labor should be concerned about. But it still has not made the full movement over to understanding that opposing the empire, when you oppose the growth of the military and these huge expenditures, you are opposing the idea that the United States is the policeman of the world, right? And as what I was going to say about the WikiLeaks situation is that, to me, the amazing thing about the releases of WikiLeaks is how involved every part of the State Department and all of these consular offices and all of these embassies were involved in analyzing and seeking to control everything that was occurring in these countries. Because those of you who have traveled know that in most countries in the world, the next most important power source in any country is the U.S. Embassy. After the established government, and sometimes above the established government, the U.S. Embassy in any nation is the seat of enormous power and influence in a country. And to see how systematically our diplomatic corps was seeking to analyze and prepare the government to be able to deal and control with local leaders all around the world is really an astonishing body of work to see it all out in the open, as WikiLeaks has been doing. So I think that the key thing that we have to understand as a peace movement, as a progressive movement in the United States, is that it really does come down to all of these, you get caught up in, well, I remember being in these commercial newsrooms now for 33 years. It is really an enormous lesson in how consciousness is shaped among the American people. I'll never forget, in 1979, I was a young reporter at the Philadelphia Daily News when the hostages were seized in Iran. And I was just starting out, and I was a little naive, and I had this idea that journalists were supposed to report as much fairly, and I knew there was no objectivity, but fairly and objectively. So I come into the newsroom one day, and there is a petition on the bulletin board of the newspaper, of the reporters, that they want to send a petition to the White House to nuke Iran. They were actually, by the time I got in the newsroom, there were 15 or 20 reporters and editors that had already signed the petition that they were going to send, calling for a nuclear attack on Iran. And I'll never forget when the Afghanistan war started. A very good friend of mine, who's a reporter at the New York Daily News, who sat across the desk from me, and on the first day of the invasion, he says, he's jumping up with joy, we finally got these bastards, and blah, blah, blah. And I said to him, Don, he said, and see, look at that, they had no army. Everyone knew Afghanistan didn't have an army. So he says, I said to him, Don, the Russians got into Afghanistan very easily too, and 10 years later, right, they were still there. And it basically almost bankrupted their government. Now, here we are, 10 years later, right? And the United States military is still in Afghanistan. One of the, hopefully the byproducts of this assassination of bin Laden is hopefully that the movement will start to grow again, that there is no reason for the United States to be in Afghanistan. And that just as there was no reason for us to be in Iraq. Hopefully that movement will start again, and some good will come of what has happened. So I think that the issue of the empire and understanding that that is at the heart of defining the progressive movement in America. You know, you can watch all the stuff you want on MSNBC from all of these liberal, or now they call themselves progressive commentators. You will never hear questioning of the empire and of the need to stop the growth of the U.S. empire and to shut down this demonic idea that one nation should rule the rest of the world. And I think that that's why I believe that's the cutting edge, whether it's for labor, whether it's for the media, whether it's for activists anywhere. Not that you have to talk about it all the time, but you have to understand that that is really what divides a movement that is really going to affect substantial change in the United States, and one that is just going to put better makeup. You know, in other words, as our favorite president says, be smarter about how you continue to exercise power in the world. Anyway, I'll talk to you a little bit about the new priorities that I have seen as reported day to day. What I've spent a lot of time, as you know, in the daily news attempting to cover what is happening in New York City, which in New York City for decades has been sort of a bellwether of what's happening in urban America. One of the things that I've firmly become convinced that is happening in urban America is that the public spaces and the public institutions are being dismantled. Whether it's the public schools, whether it's the public parks, whether in all of these key institutions that bring people together and give them a sense of a common interest are being dismantled, sold off, privatized at an incredible rate. The charter school movement, for instance, it's not just a question of these individual charter schools that are being created while the public schools are being essentially abandoned, but it is that the whole idea of a community public school has been eroded. It used to be that at least the local school was the meeting place for the community. It was, the parents could walk their children to the school. Now you have all of these schools all around the city. Your child, the busing budget of New York City has skyrocketed. Why? Because now instead of kids attending their local public school and improving that public school, now they're going to a whole other, maybe another borough or another part of the borough. And now they need to be bused if they're younger children, or they've got to get the MTA passes if they're in the upper grades. But basically, the transportation expenses of the New York public schools have skyrocketed. I think it's about $1 billion now is spent just on busing children. That is a total waste of money if the money had been spent on actually improving the local community schools instead of sending children for 40 minutes or 45 minutes to find a school that their parents can at least find acceptable. So that these are hidden ways that the costs of the privatization that has occurred and the destruction of the community school, the public parks. I wrote a bunch of stories about how Randall's Island, this incredible jewel of land in the middle of the East River, and the attempt of the city to do a contract with all the private schools in Manhattan to basically pay to have the fields reserved for them, the Park Field. And there were, the Bloomberg administration kept fighting to do it. There were two court decisions that struck it down because they never went through proper democratic procedures, taking it to the city council, having a ULURP, a land use review procedure. So the city was not able to get it done. And they ended up spending $65–70 million to re-outfit the schools. But they were never able to get the deal with the private schools, so they just let the private schools use it anyway without a deal. But now, I just learned that they are going to, in essence, give a whole group of those schools to a private, for-profit group called IMG that does sports camps at, I think it's $600 to $900 a week in baseball, football, soccer, lacrosse. And the city, knowing that they're going to have problems with this, they just told the company, you give the Parks Department a $200,000 donation. And we will let you use these fields this summer, for free, right? And they say it's not a deal, it's just an experimental project. Now, I did the math on this deal, and they're expecting to have 400 kids. I think it's 7 weeks, and it comes to they're going to be taking in about $2 million and change, and they're going to be giving the city a $200,000 donation. So the donation is a write-off, and this is all on public land. That the city, and the city's argument is, get this, that the fields during the summer weekdays of July and August are not sufficiently utilized. And so therefore there's plenty of room to let a private company have them. Now, have you heard that ball fields in New York City are not utilized during the summer? Well, I mean, one of the problems, of course, is that Randall's Island is on an island. So there are, you basically have to drive onto the island over the Triborough Bridge, or you have to walk over the footbridge from East Harlem, which the Randall's Island Sports Foundation keeps closed. They raise the bridge most of the year, except for the summer months, so that the kids from East Harlem can't get in. You can also take you take a bus on 125th Street into Randall's Island. But Randall's Island, while it belongs to East Harlem, is really much closer to the Bronx. I've been to the tip of Randall's Island, and the waterway between Randall's Island and the Bronx is like from where I'm standing to the second row over there. That's all it is. The city has never built a road from the South Bronx into Randall's Island, even though it would be a very, very cheap expense to do. So in essence, Randall's Island has been turned into a private preserve, private tennis clubs, the Icon Field, which is used for all kinds of private events. They have all kinds of other activities with very high fees. And it's now this little preserve of the well-to-do, and the city is deliberately not making it accessible and then claiming that because of lack of use, and that they have to now figure out a way to give this to this for-profit company. This is the same thing you're seeing in what's it, Brooklyn Bridge Park here. All of these attempts at all parks now are being privatized, just as the schools are increasingly being privatized. The public spaces that the taxpayers of this city have paid for over and over again over the years are increasingly being privatized. And no one is saying anything about it. Or the local community groups are fighting in each of the different areas, but there's no sort of like citywide movement to really stop this appropriation of the public lands and public spaces. So I think that this is a byproduct of the increased militarization and privatization of functions in our society, and that that I try to expose or tackle as much as I can in my writings. And as I often tell people at Democracy Now!, I don't know. I often ask myself, why the heck do I stay at the Daily News? Because I have to see the other stuff that's in there, you know. But I spent a lot of time trying to educate my fellow reporters and trying to, because I understand that most of them just don't have the courage to stand up. They are so worried about getting a promotion, getting a raise, being considered a part of the team, that they don't understand that in a newspaper, just as any institution in our society, there is a constant battle that has to be waged by the workers of that institution to have some socially useful purpose to their work, to be able to stand up for people who do not have the influence and the power that they have where they are, and that the media workers of America do have an important role to play. It's just that they are disjointed, not sufficiently organized, not clear in their analysis of what the problems are in our media system. So I just refuse to cede the platform completely to those who would seek to present a distorted view of what's going on in the world. Anyway, so I think that those are my key points for you, is to understand that the military budget of the United States and this militarization is not new. It's part and parcel of the development of the expansion of the settler state and the creation of the American empire. And that the key role of all progressives, defining to me the role of all progressives, is to what degree you build consciousness and understanding of the need to oppose the empire. And also to understand that there are victories. On Democracy Now! We often report about what is going on in Latin America the last 10 years. But I don't think that people fully appreciate that an entire region of the world has now developed incredible progress, both in greater democracy, no wars, no nuclear weapons, right? Very little armed guerrilla conflict. There's still some, but very little armed guerrilla conflict. Independence from the Washington Consensus and the global bodies, greater independence and unity among themselves. While income disparities have been escalating in the rest of the world, in Latin America, income disparities have been shrinking. Right? There is far less income disparity in Latin America today than there was 10 years ago in a host of countries, because the social programs that these new, and of course they have great variety in their approaches to politics and their popular support, but there is no arguing that they are creating an entirely different model where no imperial power is dominating Latin America today, and it is increasingly independent in its foreign policy, in its relationships among the nations of Latin America. So I think that there's a real model for popular, and many of these presidents came to power as a result of popular movements that were not linked to the old trade unions, to the old political parties. Many of them were popular movements linked to the indigenous populations and the marginalized populations of those countries. Those popular movements broke through everything, got these leaders elected. Some have delivered better than others, but that always happens. But the general thrust of the entire movement has been in the direction that really, if the rest of the world were where Latin America is today, we'd have a much different kind of world right now. So I think that there have been successes, and I think everyone who's involved in those movements in Latin America understands the necessity to oppose imperial domination. Because after all, Latin America was the backyard of the American empire. It is where so many of the American multinational corporations first developed and grew to prominence and power. So, so I think that we should be thankful. There's only a few countries still that are not in this process yet. Mexico is still behind. Colombia is still behind. But overall, most of the countries there have had extraordinary changes, and we should celebrate it and see it as part of our movement. It is part of our movement. And also that the Latin Americans who are in this country, who are the product of the empire, are increasingly affected by those changes. And, you know, I was just noting there was a walkout. There was a walkout in Chicago on Monday. 11 high schools. Thousands of students from 11 high schools walked out in Chicago. They had civil disobedience. They were arrested in the streets. And they were all largely immigrant kids protesting over the failure of the U.S. government to do anything about the immigration and the fact that the Obama administration is deporting more people even than under the Bush administration. And the students all went on, started their social network calls for a march tomorrow to the Cook County Jail, where there are hundreds of undocumented immigrants who are in the process of being deported. And they have called for a massive march of the young people of Chicago to the Cook County Jail tomorrow, Mother's Day, under the slogan, "Hey, hey, Obama, don't deport my mama." So there will be a Mother's Day protest in Chicago tomorrow, and who knows if this might not, because remember, Chicago sparked the big marches of 2006. The first one was in Chicago. And the huge marches that went from March to May Day of 2006, they started first in Chicago. So let's see what happens tomorrow, Mother's Day. And remember that, hey, hey, Obama, don't deport my mama. Thank you.
Mr. Juan Gonzalez. Incredible. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts and feelings about. Those of you who have workshops at 3:10, I'm sorry, but time to get moving. I'd also like to mention that Letitia James, we call her the Fighting City Councilwoman. She's here, and I would love for her to come and just say, no, she doesn't want to say anything. There she is right over there. She's another person that demonstrates courage on all levels. Also, Mr. Gonzalez will be staying here to answer a couple of questions for you. I wanted to mention at 4:45, we're going to have a couple of questions.
19th century. It's by Stephen Rockwell.
Just come right here and ask. Sorry, Mr. Gonzalez, it was just
The question is just, what do you say to those people who have this deep, deep fear and distrust of the government? This is in relation to what you said about privatizing.
When you say, what do I say to them? Well, that they got. Well, I think that the reality is that in the modern world that we live today, we depend so much on government for all kinds of things that people have no problems with. You know, I think what's happened is that there is an attempt to delegitimize elected government. Because one of the interesting things that's happened, for instance, with the public schools is the enormous amount of takeovers of public school systems by states, generally in the big cities, because obviously in the suburbs that would never be permitted. The people who elect their school boards in the suburbs run their school districts. But it's only in the cities that suddenly government is being delegitimized, even its ability to run public school systems, unless there is a firm authoritarian hand. So I think what's happening is the attempt to delegitimize government is an attempt to dismantle democratic government. The problem that you have is one person, one vote is a very dangerous thing, you know. So therefore, increasingly in the United States, we're seeing the functions of government taken over by non-elected bodies that hold growth of authorities. For instance, to whether it's the Industrial Development Authority and with the Transportation Authority, much of the functions of government now are operated by non-elected bodies. So that because I think the power elite in the country increasingly understood after the 1960s and 70s that African Americans, minorities, and working people, because of the expansion of the franchise, were going to increasingly have a say in the running of their local governments. So they began developing more and more of these private authorities, where basically appointed officials are running so many parts of government. So I think what's happening is the attack on government is really an attempt to delegitimize democratic government and to lift up the model of competent business management to run our government services. Obviously, the prime example for us being Michael Bloomberg. As I say, Michael Bloomberg, he says he's beholden to no special interest. He is the special interest. Other politicians are bought. Bloomberg does the buying. It's a whole different. He's inverted the whole process. But I think that's what's going on. There's an attempt to delegitimize government. Now, people, yes, there's corruption in government, absolutely. There's always been corruption in democratic government. But it's as if, there's corruption in trade unions. Do you abolish the trade unions? No. You get out the people that are involved in the corruption, and you maintain the union as a force for collective bargaining and collective representation of the workers.
Beautiful. Yes.
Juan, what could you say about currently what's happening in Wisconsin? There were 200,000 people who were demonstrating, but we don't hear much about it now. Is there a continuation, or what's actually happening, the status now?
Thank you.
Well, I think that there's still an enormous fervor in Wisconsin, but unfortunately, that movement is spreading. The movement that spawned the Wisconsin a popular uprising is spreading across the country as more and more states are adopting regulations and laws to limit the power of workers to unionize. And I've often said on Democracy Now, most Americans do not understand when they hear the word collective bargaining. They say, "What's that?" Collective bargaining really is democracy in the workplace, because in the normal situation where you don't have a union, the boss rules. The boss is the dictator. You have no rights other than the minimal federal rights. And then, of course, you would have to depend on the federal government to actually enforce those rights. But you have no rights unless you have a recognition that the workers can collectively bargain with you. No worker individually, very few, have the power to bargain with their boss. So that the importance of collective bargaining really is establishing some sort of democratic accountability in the workplace. So it's really democracy in the workplace. The workplace in the United States is the least democratic place in the entire country. Right? It's the one place where you really have no say other than to whatever the boss tells you to do, you got to do. If he tells you to work late, you will work late. If he tells you you're not producing, and if you don't produce more, then you have no way really to argue because there's absolute authority in the company and the boss. Only in a situation where you have a collective bargaining agreement, where you have enunciated rights, where you have a grievance procedure, can you effectively have some kind of say in the most important thing that most of us do every day besides raise our children is work to survive.
I want to first of all just encourage you to not leave the Daily News. Maybe you were talking about that somewhat facetiously, but you're probably the only person left in New York City who writes from a consistently left perspective, and I think that people need to hear that and see it. As for your colleagues, I've been a union organizer my whole life also, and I think the fact is that, and it's related to your talk, people are afraid in this country, and fear is one of the things that the empire uses to keep control. So your colleagues, just like folks all around the country, are scared to death of what's going to happen in the future. Your industry is not in great shape, and that's the case for many other industries too. And I also think one more aspect of it is that, like you and I sort of grew up at a time where there were real victories that people had around the world against the empire. And it was inspiring to us, and the other day, April 30th was the 36th anniversary of the Vietnamese victory. And that was inspiring to people. And so I think that there aren't that many things that people are inspired about now. And so it's just another thing that makes organizing difficult.
Oh, so you didn't have a question? Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. Okay, we can only actually entertain one more person, but Mr. Gonzalez is going to stay and answer people's question afterwards, because we've got workshops going and, yada, yada, yada.
Okay, I'm Linda Seises from WBAI Radio, and my question to you is this. On the city streets in Brooklyn, I don't get into Manhattan except downtown, but they created the bicycle lanes, but in addition to that, they've taken away huge portions of the street, and they made it into just cement nothing. But they're ensuring that cars have only a very single lane, and actually buses block the lane so that the ambulances have trouble even getting by for long periods of time. And I keep thinking that this is a way of controlling the mobs. Not that there are any, but if you project into the future, they're taking away our streets in a very literal way. Can you speak to this?
Well, yeah, I think that, I actually think that the bike lanes are one of the positive things that the Bloomberg administration has done. Although there is quite a bit of controversy in many parts of the city about it, but I do think as I see more and more people using those bike lanes and feeling safer over the possibility that there is a defined space for them for bicycles to be able to traverse the city. I think that's a positive thing. About the other issue of the control of demonstrations, of public protests, that has been happening now for years and years, and unfortunately keeps getting eroded away. To me, the defining battle in that was when the Central Park Conservancy refused to allow an anti-war protest in Central Park because it was going to affect the grass. Now, I urge you, those of you who are familiar with GuideStar, which tracks the 990s, the tax forms of various nonprofits around the United States, take a look at the 990 of the Central Park Conservancy. They have hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. The salaries that they pay their people, they have totally privatized the gem, the public park gem of New York. And to me, the outrage, the crowning outrage that a public park would tell the public after years and years that the park has been used for all kinds of activities and concerts, that a demonstration, an anti-war demonstration, would ruin the grass. But other kinds of activities and concerts and other stuff will not ruin the grass. And I saw there's been a constant attempt to prevent the people of this city from being able to express their dissent. And unfortunately, it's I was talking to somebody in Arizona who was telling me about the many laws that have been passed in Arizona in recent years, not just the Senate Bill 1070, there have been others before that, attacking immigrants. And he said every new one that gets passed, we fight that one, but we then accept the one that was passed before that we weren't able to defeat. So that's what's happened with dissent in the city. There have been so many erosions of the right of people to protest now, that we forget all the others that have come, that have paved the way for the situation that exists now. And it's really going to have to take a major, upheaval, really, to really establish some of these, reestablish the rights that people in this city had previously to be able to exercise their democratic right of dissent. All right, thank you again, and I'll be around if anybody else wants to ask.